الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. حي على
Since the Persian Gulf War in 1991, the U.S. and Britain had been keeping a tight rein on Saddam Hussein, waging an undeclared conflict against Iraq for 12 years. President Bill Clinton had maintained sanctions and ordered airstrikes in the Iraqi no-fly zones. 1 month after the passage of the Iraq Liberation Act, the U.S. and U.K. launched a bombardment campaign of Iraq called Operation Desert Fox, in the hope that Saddam would be overthrown by political enemies inside Iraq. Clinton also signed into law H.R. 4655, the Iraq Liberation Act, which appropriated funds to Iraqi opposition groups. With the election of George W. Bush as president in 2000, the U.S. moved toward a more aggressive policy toward Iraq. The Republican Party's campaign platform in the 2000 election called for full implementation of the Iraq Liberation Act and removal of Hussein when the time was right.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
Iraq was just one of the 3 axis of evil states named by then-President George W. Bush in his speech to the nation that January night. Bush's catalog of Iraqi transgressions was far more detailed and extensive than that of Iran and North Korea, the other 2 states comprising this axis. In January of 2002, the United States had already achieved a significant victory over terrorism. Operation Enduring Freedom, begun on October 7, 2001, scored a quick and decisive defeat of the terrorist-sponsoring Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The Al-Qaeda terrorist organization, hosted by the Taliban and responsible for the attack of September 11, 2001, was decimated and on the run. Although the war in Afghanistan would continue until Al-Qaeda and their leaders were brought to justice, the president made it clear that the war on terror would not end with victory in Afghanistan or the death of Al-Qaeda. He was dedicated to defeating terrorism throughout the world and Iraq was at the top of the list of states that the U.S. would bring to justice. It was just a matter of time until the Iraqi regime was engaged. The plan for that engagement may have been in the works long before the attacks of September 11, 2001.
George W. Bush's first Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named Paul O'Neill, later gave extensive interviews with a journalist, Ron Susskind, who reported and even released some documents that suggested even at the very first National Security Council meeting of the George W. Bush administration that the question of Iraq was on the table. In fact, the first sort of foreign policy adventure of the new Bush administration was a bombing, a U.S. air bombing of Iraq, but shouldn't take that too out of context because the Clinton administration had spent much of the 1990s periodically bombing Iraq for alleged violations of the no-fly zone and other kinds of grievances. So that was just one. I mean, it showed that the problem of Iraq was ongoing. In fact, to sort of think about the context, even as the United States and Great Britain were basically enforcing a no-fly zone within Iraq, that was not a UN Security Council mandate. It was basically created by the U.S. and Great Britain. That the French and the Russians were spending a good portion of that decade arguing that the sanctions regime is bad policy. Hundreds of thousands of innocents within Iraq, children many of them, are suffering as a consequence of the sanction regime, so we need to end this and think of a new way to address Iraq. And so you had kind of a weird set of circumstances coming together when the Bush administration came in, because you had some hardliners that thought on to Baghdad should have been policy before and certainly would be policy the next time, and you had the world that still thought about Iraq, as this long-term problem that the policy isn't necessarily working.
The Iraq of President Saddam Hussein was the model of a rogue nation, an outlaw state that attacked its neighbors and governed its people by terror. It had fought an 8-year war with Iran in the 1980s, which ended inconclusively after millions of deaths on both sides. It had invaded and occupied Kuwait in 1990, only to be ejected in 1991 by a U.S.-led coalition of nations. Although this defeat was humiliatingly decisive and extremely costly, Saddam Hussein continued to defy the international community by terrorizing his citizenry and imposing an image of power in the region by creating a perception that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction.
You probably know about the Project for a New American Century, right? There were a number of people that became prominent in the administration who formed basically a think tank to make some planning for the possibility of a new Republican administration, starting in the late 1990s, but they were even active during the Clinton administration. So they had written a letter to President Clinton in support of a policy that the Congress ended up passing and the Clinton administration ended up signing, which was basically that U.S. policy called for regime change in Iraq. Now, it's not at all clear the Clinton administration essentially had any interest in pursuing this very actively. I mean, there were some monies appropriated by the Republican-controlled Congress that supported some Iraqi groups around the world, some of them dissident, to try to think about what ways you might have to topple Saddam sort of non-violently. But there were certainly elements within Project for a New American Century that thought, aha, this is, the Democrats agreeing with us that Saddam Hussein has to go. Now, the report, the long document they ended up producing, actually, Iraq is sort of a minor player. There's a huge call for rethinking American defense policy and sort of rebuilding America's prominence in the world, but the major foe that they were imagining was China.
The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. on September 11th galvanized the Bush administration and gave America the justification it needed to invade Iraq and settle unfinished business there.
after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, there was some serious thinking in Washington about, what should the U.S. do sort of after Afghanistan about these lingering problems of terrorism and the potential that terrorism might be something much bigger than the problem of dog bites or bathtub falls, right? That the scale perhaps had changed. And the way that terrorism becomes a game-changing event is probably if it's linked to nation states that can provide it resources, financial support, technological support, etc. And particularly if those states, often at that time and through the 90s called rogue states, sort of outlaw states, that if they were pursuing weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and worst possible of all, nuclear weapons. So if there was a nexus between these things, states that sponsor terrorism and states that are developing weapons of mass destruction, what happens if those things all come together and they decide to build these weapons and give them to the terrorists to use to basically advance their foreign policy without having to suffer necessarily the direct blame for that policy? And so that's what I think became the central idea driving what became the Bush Doctrine, which was the idea that the U.S. might preventively use force, although the language was usually preemptively, because for international law purposes, preemption has long been seen as legal, while prevention is much more dubious. But it essentially was a preventive policy to prevent these things long before they happen, because by the time there's a smoking gun, or worse, a mushroom cloud, then it's too late, right? So you can't predict the activity of terrorists in the same way that you can predict, hopefully, the activity of nation states. Nation states have territory and peoples, and they can be deterred, hopefully, and that's long been the idea of U.S. foreign policy, vis-a-vis different kinds of threats. I mean, that was central to containment, which was not only a policy used during the Cold War to stop Soviet expansionism, but which was actually a dual containment of Iran and Iraq during the 1990s. So containment is a flexible policy that can try to prevent bad things from happening. But how do you prevent terrorists when you don't even know where they are? They're intentionally trying to disguise themselves. So when you have that particular motive, trying to stop that particular strain of what George W. Bush called evil, if you have to try to constrain that form of evil in that particular guise, then that was the justification for the Bush Doctrine, which could be targeted against their state sponsors.
The Bush Doctrine was the idea that to enhance or to ensure American national security, we might need to take preemptive action in certain cases. In other words, if a country is getting to the point where it is threatening enough to our security that we are not simply going to wait for an attack and then respond to it, but that we might move in preemptively and eliminate the threat to us. And that was articulated by Condoleezza Rice, who was National Security Advisor at that time. And it really upset a lot of people, but I'd suggest great powers do that in any event. It may not be smart to go ahead and announce it, just as I don't think it was terribly smart of the president to talk about an axis of evil. Things like that don't get you very far. But great powers would tend to reserve that right of preemptive strike to themselves in any case. I'm not sure, though, that you need to advertise it.
Since 1991, sanctions imposed on Iraq without consequences proved not to be an effective deterrent. Saddam continued to flaunt his disdain of a series of UN resolutions. Even bombing of military centers for violations of the no-fly zone did not faze Saddam. The Bush administration wanted a more permanent solution.
After September 11th, there was some serious thinking in Washington about how to think about this problem, because I think the way that George W. Bush put it in a speech that he gave on September 20th, 2001 is, the United States didn't want to send multi-million-dollar missiles into a $20 tent, right? I mean, it was not the kind of exchange that was going to pay off, because, he didn't say it, but if you send that kind of missile into a tent, you might be creating more angry people and more terrorists, right? So the thing was to think strategically about what this problem was. And so the real huge concern about terrorism was that it was transformed into something that might kill thousands, or worse, hundreds of thousands or millions of people, rather than on the scale of dog bites or bathtub falls. And if that was going to happen, it was likely going to require state sponsorship, and especially the kind of rogue states that were pursuing weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. And so those states quickly became the ones under the microscope, and they had already been an important part of American foreign policy throughout the 1990s.
This concern about WOMDs was nothing new.
Because if you look at those states, it's Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya. Libya was sort of an ambiguous position. It had been a much bigger concern back in the early Reagan years in the 80s we talked about before. It wasn't in the same kind of situation. North Korea's ties to terrorism were, some old former terrorists from the 70s that had hijacked planes and taken Japanese prisoners and things like that. So it wasn't really the same kind of terrorism. And so Iraq quickly rose to the top of that list. Even the axis of evil that George W. Bush identified, it was clear that Iraq was a central part of that. And the great fear was that these states might work with terrorist networks so that without attribution for the state's foreign policy, in other words, they'd be blameless, these terrorists might pursue, nefarious agendas that would be very much anti-Western and would be part of these threats to the United States that it did not want to see occur. So, the reason why Iraq became so important, and any potential countries that were pursuing weapons of mass destruction and state sponsorship of terrorism, was because of that nexus.
The question soon became how to get the American people to go along with this change of direction in the war on terror. The issue of Iraq's disarmament reached a crisis in the fall of 2002, when President Bush demanded a complete end to alleged Iraqi production of weapons of mass destruction and full compliance with UN Security Council Resolutions 1441, requiring UN weapons inspectors unfettered access to suspected weapons production facilities. The UN had prohibited Iraq from developing or possessing such weapons after the Gulf War, and required Iraq to permit inspections confirming compliance. Bush repeatedly warned of military action unless inspections were allowed to progress. Iraq reluctantly agreed to new inspections in November of 2002. The weapons inspections did not uncover any WOMD in Iraq. Shortly before the invasion, Hans Bix, the lead weapons inspector, advised the UN Security Council that Iraq was cooperating with inspections, and that the confirmation of disarmament through inspections could be achieved in a short period of time if Iraq remained cooperative. But the Bush administration thought that was not enough.
The Bush administration had signaled throughout 2002 that Iraq was increasingly under the microscope. In January, in the State of the Union address, President Bush mentioned the axis of evil and identified Iraq, and through that year, there was trickling of things. Some of the European governments were grumbling about it or whatever. In August of 2002, Dick Cheney gave a speech for the veterans of foreign wars, where he made some very major claims about the potential threat from Iraq, both in terms of sponsoring of terrorism and developing weapons of mass destruction. Claims that, for the most part, have now been proven decisively wrong. But at the time, they helped set the tenor for this discussion.
Not wanting to act alone, the USA took its case to the United Nations.
basically the Bush administration announced in a series of moves in September and October that they wanted the U.S. Congress and the United Nations to take seriously this threat from Saddam, that they were considering a grave and gathering threat that needed urgent action. And so as a member of the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. basically brought this group together and said, you know, let's fix this lingering problem. You know, I mentioned already that coming into the Bush presidency, France and Russia had been arguing to lift the sanctions or develop smart sanctions. You know, there were different ways of thinking about Iraq. But by the fall, you know, the focus was on we need coercive leverage to prevent the kinds of cat and mouse games that he had been playing during the 1990s with the Clinton administration. So we need to find out decisively if there are any of these weapons of mass destruction programs still underway, if they're hidden or whatever. Basically, the inspections regime had ended in 1998 when the Clinton administration basically had warned the United Nations that we're going to bomb, and so you better get out. And then after that, they were never put back in. So there were several years there where essentially there was no new intelligence coming in about the status of those programs. Although at the time, in the 1990s, it was very clear that Iraq had made a number of moves to dismantle these chemical, biological, nuclear programs, had to destroy an awful lot of stuff. There was an awful lot of documentation about much of that, but it wasn't completely decisively eliminated. So part of the debate that started at the United Nations at the fall of 2002 was, you know, to go back into Iraq, get the inspections regime going again quickly, and so we can determine decisively whether or not Iraq is in breach, material breach of these agreements that the United Nations Security Council had made at the end of the first Persian Gulf War, you know, basically a decade before. So it was to think about whether they're in breach, and if they're in breach, then what to do about it.
The CIA had contacted Iraq's foreign minister, Naji Sabri, who was being paid by the French as an agent. Sabri informed them that Saddam had hidden poison gas among Sunni tribesmen, had ambitions for a nuclear program, but that it was not active, and that no biological weapons were being produced or stockpiled, although research was underway. According to Sidney Blumenthal, George Tenet briefed Bush on September 18, 2002, that Sabri had informed them that Iraq did not have WOMD. Bush dismissed this top-secret intelligence from Hussein's inner circle, which had been approved by 2 senior CIA officers. The information was never shared with Congress or CIA agents examining whether Saddam had such weapons. In October 2002, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution to authorize the use of United States Armed Forces against Iraq, a vote many in Congress would soon regret. The resolution authorized the President to use any means necessary against Iraq. But would the American people support direct military action in Iraq? Americans polled in January 2003 widely favored further diplomacy over invasion. Later that year, however, Americans began to agree with Bush's plan. The U.S. government engaged in an elaborate domestic public relations campaign to market the war to its citizens. Americans overwhelmingly believed Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction. 85% said so, even though the inspectors had not uncovered those weapons. By February 2003, 74% of Americans supported taking military action to remove Hussein from power.
Iraq clearly had a nuclear program in the early 1990s. There are some who say they were much closer at the end of the Persian Gulf War to a nuclear bomb than anybody ever knew. They clearly had developed chemical weapons. They used chemical weapons in the war against Iran back in the early 1980s, even at a time that the U.S. was forming, ties with them. So the capacity to develop these weapons really wasn't so much in question. It was whether or not they had the facilities and the technology to do it, and whether they were actually doing it. And so the inspectors, after this reporting, then started to go into Iraq to make sure that they were in compliance with these agreements that they were coerced into making a decade before about essentially eliminating these programs. And the UN investigated many of the claims that were flying around, some of them that had been generated, for instance, in that report that the intelligence community in the US put together for the Congress. And so they investigated these high power magnets, they investigated these aluminum tubes that were of particular length, all things that were claimed by the sort of war hawks, if you will, that were instrumental to an Iraqi weapons of mass destruction program. But the inspectors on the ground basically found almost nothing. They did find that Iraq had developed a missile that had a range that slightly exceeded what was allowed, but then they started the process of destroying them, and Iraq didn't resist that. There were I think they found a couple of old chemical weapon shells that had been left over from the 1980s that, there was great question about whether or not they would even work. They clearly weren't some kind of new program or development, but they basically didn't find anything, and they were able to decisively demonstrate that some allegations were just not true. For instance, later in the US debate, the president in Cincinnati in October of 2002, and again in the State of the Union address in January of 2003, mentioned these allegations about Iraq going to Niger and arranging for yellow cake uranium to come back, and there were these papers. Mohammed al-Baradei reported to the United Nations in March of 2003 that those were obvious forgeries. So there were many things that basically the UN weapons inspectors decisively demonstrated, but the attitude in the Bush administration was, well, the weapons inspectors had been wrong about Iraq before, so we are not going to listen to them this time. And so even though it turned out the weapons inspectors were basically able to find out lots of information and were able to determine, not ultimately conclusively, but they were making clear progress that they couldn't find anything, because now we know it turned out there was nothing to find, but that was all basically brushed aside eventually when the decision was made to go to war.
On February 5, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell presented further evidence in his Iraqi WOMD program presentation to the UN Security Council that unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, were ready to be launched against the east coast of the United States. A meeting between George W. Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair took place on January 31, 2003, in the White House. Bush and Blair made a secret deal to carry out the invasion, regardless of whether WOMD were discovered by UN weapons inspectors, in direct contradiction with statements Blair made to the British House of Commons afterwards, that the Iraqi regime would be given a final chance to disarm. Bush is paraphrased as saying, the start date for the military campaign was now penciled in for 10 March. This was when the bombing would begin. Bush said to Blair that he thought it would be unlikely that there would be internecine warfare between the different religious and ethnic groups in Iraq after the war. War was about to come again to the land between the rivers.